Thank you very much, Connie, and thank you for having me here. It's been a really fascinating morning so far. You're all a hard act to follow, and the discussions have been really interesting. So I'm going to talk about the relationship of culture and infrastructure and how they reinforce each other, particularly talking about experienced risk, about how people experience safety or not on our roads, which I think is a big issue for us in Britain and a big issue for you here too. So I'm going to say something about this concept of experienced risk, and in particular, how I tried to measure it through looking at near misses or near collisions that people were experiencing. Then say something about equity and the importance of diversifying cycling, of getting a wider range of people on their bikes. And finally, just conclude thinking about tools for change, because one of the problems that we face is that transport planning has historically been car planning, and it's really hard to plan for walking and cycling when all your tools are about cars, planning and providing for cars. So, as I was saying, culture and infrastructure are not separate. I really strongly believe that they're connected, that infrastructure is cultural, the kind of infrastructure we get is cultural, how people use it is cultural, and culture itself is created also by infrastructure, by policy, by law, and so on. And understanding this, I think, is really important for thinking about risk, how people think about risk. In Britain, many people say, cycling is too dangerous, I am terrified to cycle. And why is this? What do they mean by this? Traditionally, many cycle planners have said, you're wrong, cycling is safe. You know, we've told people they're wrong, what they feel is wrong. And actually, we've changed, I think. We've started listening to people and started understanding that people are not wrong about risk. And it's not good enough to say, okay, there's a bus behind you, but don't worry, it's all fine, it won't kill you. Actually, they want not to have that bus behind them. This is one example of an approach to risk that I guess, to some extent, I've been challenging in my work, which is a comparison. The question is what you compare cycling risk to. And I really think we need to go beyond the statistics. We need to go beyond saying, you know, this many deaths per cycle trip, this many injuries per cycle trip. But sometimes we compare cycling, for instance, to leisure activities, which again, I think is kind of mistaken because people cycle to work or to the shops. They are not comparing it with something you do at the weekend or as a sport. So I wasn't reassured to hear that cycling in New Zealand is safer than horse riding, snow sports and rugby. I think we need to, you know, actually understand what people are saying about risk and what they feel about risk. So risk is not only quantitative. Risk, even if risk was quantitative, there's the question of what you compare it to. People don't do cost-benefit calculations, but if they did, what would they compare the risk of cycling to? To horse riding or to car driving? You know, what do you choose as a comparator? But I think that fundamentally, risk is qualitative. Risk is something you experience, you feel, and that's why telling people, no, you're wrong, cycling is safer than horse riding or rugby is a mistake, because that's not how they feel, how they experience cycling, how they see cycling. Writers about risk have talked about the things that matter in relation to risk. For instance, level of control. If I feel I have control over a risk, I'm more likely to accept it. If the risk is normalized, I'm more likely to accept it. If it's seen as fair, if all parties are seen as sharing risk fairly, I'm more likely to accept that risk. So actually, it's not at all strange that people go skiing on holiday, but they are frightened of our roads. They are very different things. People make different judgments about the roads compared to going on a skiing holiday. And I think I would add, risk is not just perceived. It's not just that you read a newspaper and think cycling is dangerous. It's actually what you experience, actually walking around or in a car or on a bus. You see what cycling is like. You see what walking is like. You make judgments about risk and about comfort. So this was why I got interested in looking at near misses, near collisions, incidents that might have injured someone but didn't. And there are three reasons for this, really. Firstly, I feel road safety is very reactive. In Britain, we improve a road if someone dies. That's maybe we do, maybe we don't, but that's how it works. And there are many stretches of road that, cyclists and pedestrians say are unsafe that will not be changed until someone dies. And I thought that's fundamentally a wrong approach. We need to take, in air transport, you don't wait till someone dies. You actually learn from near misses. You learn. In train, when we're talking about railways, signals past a danger, we learn from that. We stop deaths happening before they happen. But on the roads, we don't. So I thought, if we look at near misses, if we look at nearly incidents, perhaps we can stop some of those deaths. But also, I wanted to understand road culture and how that affected cycling experience. So in the UK, we have a very toxic road culture, I think, or that's what I've discovered through research and, frankly, through walking and cycling, but through research, that we have a situation where bad driver behaviour is normalised. The kind of behaviour that would be seen as outrageous in another situation on the roads is seen as perfectly reasonable. I also wanted to clarify that relationship around perceived risk, that people were saying, I am terrified to cycle. And on the other hand, the cycle planners, some of the cycle planners were saying, you will only die once every 8,000 years if you cycle. So what are you worried about? It's all fine. So this is my research, the research project that I led. We asked people to sign up to participate in the project and keep a diary over one day of cycle trips and any incidents that they experienced. So incidents where they were not injured, but they were frightened, or they were annoyed, upset by something. And we had over 2,500 participants from the UK, and they recorded over 6,000 incidents, so it was a lot of data. And it was the first study to estimate a national near-miss rate that we could compare with injury risks. So, just to say something about the people who responded before I tell you a few of the results. Over 70% were male. Sadly, that's pretty representative of the UK cycling population. Many of them were middle-aged adults. Most of them were either weekday commuter or other utility cyclists, so they were making daily trips to work, to the shops. A few of them were cycle tourists, or they were doing Sunday trips into the countryside. Most of them were experienced long-term cyclists. These were people who had been cycling for 10 or 20 years in the UK. They were used to the conditions. They were not people who had just started cycling. So this is what I found in terms of the rates of near misses that these people were recording over over their cycling. The day's cycling. So this, I calculated, I compared the roughly how frequently people would experience these different things if they were a regular commuting cyclist in the UK. So, as you can see, you would only die once every 8,000 years of regular cycle commuting. So, in a sense, that would seem safe. You would only be seriously injured once every 400 years. But if you look down at some of those figures at the bottom, that's from my research project. People would experience harassment or abuse, like having a can thrown at them, being shouted at, being harassed on the roads, every month or two. And they would experience a very frightening incident once a week. So near misses are very, very common, and they are something that is normal. Even very frightening experiences are normal. None of these were recorded, this was data that was not being collected. So just establishing how often these things were happening, I think, was important. Just to let you know the types of incident that people were experiencing. So we coded all these different incidents, and they fell into clear patterns. Basically, the most common type of incident was people having their way blocked. So there might be a parked car in the way, in the cycle lane, for instance. But other types of incident, which were often more serious, were things like close passes, so being overtaken very closely. Having a car pull out at a side road, and as a cyclist you have to swerve, you have to stop, or near left or right hooks at junctions, so for us usually left hooks, where a vehicle is turning and the cyclist is going straight on. So many of these types of incident we see on collision reports, we see on coroner's reports after deaths. So many of these things potentially could lead to very serious consequences. And I think this is important for thinking about risk, because people know many of these types of incident could lead to serious consequences. As I was just saying, they varied in seriousness. So, for instance, a near-dooring was very often considered scary. So that's a car driver opening a door and not looking for cyclists, and the cyclist has to swerve out the way. We have, quite a lot of deaths in the UK happen through that kind of incident. One of the things that was interesting and worrying about this data was when we looked at differences in experiences, differences in terms of the number of near misses, we found that the slowest cyclists were experiencing per mile the most incidents. So for people who ride slowly, UK roads are particularly hostile. So that is a problem for us, for getting a greater diversity of people cycling. It means that you have to be a road warrior, you have to ride fast to be able to minimize those kind of experiences. Something else that we found was that new cyclists, those who had only been cycling for under 2 years, had twice as many very scary incidents per day as more experienced cyclists. So this kind of fits with the last point, that those people who are cycling more slowly, less experienced, new cyclists are having particularly bad experiences. And this is important. We know that, for instance, in London, maybe a quarter or a third of cyclists stop in any year. They stop cycling. Why is this? We don't know exactly. We don't have the data, but I think this is quite important. If you think someone takes up cycling, within their first week, they have 2 very frightening experiences. Will they continue? Many of them probably don't. And some of the data, I can only sort of say a little bit about it now, but some of the data that had the most impact on me was the qualitative data. People described their experiences, and you read it and you think, wow, what have we created? We've created a situation where people, a transport mode that we're supposed to be promoting and encouraging, we've created conditions that are so hostile. And people manage, a lot of the people in my study said, I didn't realize how bad things were till I wrote them down. I actually, I have got used to this situation, but actually I realized things are really bad. So I'll just read the middle quote, which really is one that really stayed with me. They said, an accumulation of these events has made me super cautious, and I now believe it's not sufficient simply to obey the rules to stay alive. To stay alive, one must also anticipate that all others will be careless. What kind of a situation are we creating in which you have to assume that nobody else is looking out for you? This is the kind of situation that we have on the roads in the UK. So from this project, the other things that came out in terms of road culture, the qualitative aspects, people really wanted to be separated from motor traffic. That many of these frightening incidents, they said, we would like protected space, we would like to be separated from these drivers, from these vehicles. And people were frustrated with what they saw as a might is right road culture, that those with the most powerful vehicles seem to have the most be prioritised on the roads. And in some parts of Britain, we have a modal hierarchy. So, policymakers will say pedestrians are first, cyclists are second, public transport and the car. And my respondents said it's the opposite. The biggest vehicle, the lorries, the SUVs are prioritised most, and the cyclists and pedestrians are actually last and expected to get off the road. And that's what you learn every day going out in motor traffic. That's what people had learnt. In response, though, some positive things are happening. Increasingly in at least in London, in some other parts of Britain too, to some extent, there's a growing understanding that subjective safety or comfort is really important, that we cannot expect people to cycle if they are being terrified on a weekly basis. That is not acceptable. And increasingly, police services, local authorities are getting cyclists and other road users sometimes as well, to record near misses and use them in planning. So it's really great to see that, to see authorities actually counting these incidents, looking at where they happen. Another example is that police services in Britain are increasingly running close pass operations. They're sending out police officers in plain clothes on bicycles. And then if a motorist overtakes them too closely, a police car will stop the motorist and will say, did you know you are meant to give them as much room as you would give a car? And the motorists know that really, but they never expected that they would be stopped and told this is against the law. So this is interesting, and it's a big shift. This is one example. This is on Waterloo Bridge recently, where the cycle lane was basically, it's not a good cycle lane anyway, but it was closed. They're doing bridge repairs, and it's very narrow, the carriageway, but motorists try and overtake. So the Transport for London put up signs saying, do not overtake cyclists. But the motorists ignored the signs. So the police are standing out there saying, stopping people and saying, you need to wait behind cyclists. Now, this is not perfect. Really, this is a horrible road environment and it shouldn't be like that. But at least, we have made some progress in that keeping cyclists safe is more of an enforcement focus than it used to be. Okay, so I wanted to spend a little time saying something about equity, because the Near Miss project did show that, women, new cyclists, were experiencing worse conditions. And I think this is important for our lack of equity in cycling. In Britain, we have very unequal cycling. And I think there's a bit of a mindset change going on there. Traditionally, we've seen cycling as an individual choice. I choose to cycle. I choose not to cycle. But actually, we need to think of cycling as a system, like the public transport system. And it's one that often excludes many people. And there's a whole range of exclusions. So bicycle infrastructure or lack of bicycle infrastructure is often exclusive. In Britain, we like to put steps and barriers on our cycle routes. Well, if you can't get off your bike, if you're a hand cyclist, if you can't dismount, that's an absolute barrier. And actually, under disability legislation, it's illegal, really, but it still happens. There's also issues around the kind of bicycles that people need, about hire bicycles, about where we build infrastructure. There's a whole range of issues that I don't have time to talk about, but we need to look at the cycling system as a whole and see how it excludes people. Is it inclusive? Can everybody use it? Just like if you have buses and there's a step up, wheelchair users will not be able to use your buses. This just gives you a sense of some of the inequalities that we have. So disabled people, non-white people, older people, and women are all half as likely to cycle as people in those other groups, non-disabled people, white people, young people, and men. So basically we have massive underrepresentation, and it's a big problem. But traditionally, we've just seen it as normal. There's been an assumption that women in their 70s just will not cycle. But actually, we've created a system that stops them from cycling in a whole range of ways: the infrastructure, the culture, the policy. As I was saying, England has a very big gender and age gap in cycling. The blue lines are men, so you can see men cycle more than women, but you can also see that as age increases, propensity to cycle decreases sharply as well, particularly among men. So if we've been building for anyone, it's been for younger men. And even then, we've completely failed, because you can see only 5% of them are cycling. The Netherlands, as there's been some mention of the Netherlands, the picture is obviously completely different. So the red line is women. In the Netherlands, women cycle more than men, and older people cycle more proportionally of their trips than younger people. And this is the normal. This is obvious in a sense, because women have lower car access than men. They make shorter trips. They have lower incomes, so are less able to afford expensive means of transport. Why wouldn't they cycle more? But in England, we've managed to exclude women from cycling. And I think there's two problems here related to equity. So firstly, when we have general problems with cycling, when we have bad quality bike lanes, when we expect people to mix with motorised traffic, nobody likes that. But underrepresented groups are particularly excluded. So in my research, I looked at preferences for protected bicycle infrastructure. Generally, men and women both want protected infrastructure, but women even more so. So if we don't have protected infrastructure, that creates inequalities. But also, we need to think about specific needs and problems of underrepresented groups. So, for instance, disabled people may need adapted bicycles. Those may be expensive. So we need to also look at specific needs of underrepresented groups. On the left there, I'm embarrassed to say that is our National Cycle Infrastructure Design Manual. And you can see the culture and infrastructure coming together. You build that, you get him. And he's not even that happy, we know now. He would rather be in a protected bike lane. I think I've said that. I think maybe I'll skip that slide and just say something about researching barriers to equal cycling. So increasingly there is research on cycling equity. I was just earlier this week on an event on disability in cycling in London in City Hall, and these things are very much moving up the agenda. We used to have an assumption that disabled people didn't cycle. People are fighting very hard to change that, and I'm pleased to say that there's increasing research, increasing work looking at getting underrepresented groups cycling. And some of the things that we're considering, infrastructure quality, but also things like where the infrastructure goes. So if we only build bike routes to workplaces, what about older people? They're not necessarily going to work. We need to build infrastructure to shops as well. We need to make sure that our routes serve all the kind of journeys that people want to make, and we haven't always done that. There's one of the other important issues, I think, is language and imagery. So traditionally in Britain, I think bicycle planners had one image of a cyclist, and they would drop that one image of a cyclist into every consultation. So you would see the same guy, a white guy, aged 30, on a road bike. There would be no diversity. And Transport for London had to go out and take pictures of people on cargo bikes and hand cycles, and had to make that effort to put them in the consultations. But now we are starting to get that. So you look at the images of cycling, and you think, yeah, it might be my grandmother, it might be my nephew. Yeah, this is just the review that I carried out. So I reviewed academic papers looking at the difference in preferences for protected infrastructure and looking at it by gender. So the bars are the size of the study. So the bigger bar is a study involving more participants, so probably maybe better evidence. And the red bars are studies that found that women's preferences for protected infrastructure were stronger than men's. And I think that's a pretty conclusive picture. Generally, the studies that aren't finding a difference are small and probably underpowered to find differences. So I think that's reasonably clear. We can see that general problems affect groups like women more than men, but also there are specific problems too, like street harassment. Another issue that I've been studying recently is around getting children cycling, which is something we talk a lot about in Britain, but don't actually do very much about. And I found that there was very little research on what we need to do to get children cycling. So I surveyed around 2,000 London cyclists. These are very confident people, confident cyclists. They ride in bus lanes, they ride in painted cycle lanes, they ride on busy roads. So basically this is asking them, would you cycle on your own in these kind of environments? Busy roads, painted lanes and so on. And mostly they said yes, because sadly, although we've made progress in London, this is what our infrastructure mostly still looks like. There are still bus lanes, busy roads, and so on that people negotiate. But then when I asked those people, would you cycle here with an 8-year-old? They said no. Would you let a 12-year-old cycle there? So you can see that basically a lot of what we have, the infrastructure that we have in the UK, is not seen as suitable for children, even by confident, experienced cyclists who want their children to cycle. And this disproportionately affects women as well, because women make more trips than men with children. So you can see, if we build this kind of stuff, we're discriminating against women, basically. Whereas people were happy to cycle with children. They were happy, they said they would be happy for children to cycle in these kinds of environments. So completely away from motor traffic, very, very quiet streets, properly quiet streets, and also high quality infrastructure that separates them from motorists, but also from pedestrians. We are seeing hopeful signs in London. We're seeing some signs of diversification. It's slow. You change infrastructure, you do start to get a cultural change, but it doesn't happen overnight. You have to be resolute, and you have to keep changing things, because the cycling system is a network, and if one bit changes, then if people still have to ride on the busy road, things may not change. So this is just a study of a road called Royal College Street in central London, which has a protected track. And we compared it with parallel routes, which had no protected space. And you can see on the left that on the control routes, there are 25% women on the busy roads. And that's fairly normal for London, unfortunately. But on the protected tracks, you have 33% women. So we're not there yet. We still have some way to go. But providing better infrastructure does seem to get you more women, more older people, and more people wearing normal clothes. So we're starting to get there. I think it's important that this is my justification for being a sociologist talking about engineering, that I don't think it's an engineering problem. It's a political problem. And even some of the terrible, terrible designs that we've seen in the UK happen for a reason. They don't just happen because of ignorance. They happen because car transport was prioritised. They happen because cyclists planners assumed that cyclists don't really mind dismounting, pushing their bike for a bit. They happen because we have priorities and we have assumptions. Engineers, we have good engineers, but our political priorities are often wrong. So another study I led recently looked at planners in England and their views on barriers to investing in cycling. So why were we not building more cycle infrastructure? Why were we not spending money on cycling? And it was political. A lot of the problem was political. So we have austerity, we have funding limitations, but one thing that came out of the survey was that with political leadership, anything is possible. With political leadership, funding can be found, things can change, even in difficult circumstances. So one example being a city called Leicester, which has not really had any government funding for cycling, but managed to use, a lot of European Union grants and other money in order to invest in cycling. So money could be found, things could happen. But unfortunately, often, political leadership still seems to view the car as the key to economic growth. So that even in a time of austerity, more money was being spent on cars, even though cycling is much better value. Okay, I just want to spend the last sort of 5 or 10 minutes saying something about how new tools, new methods and data can help. Because I think data is really important. Lack of data is not the key problem, but data can help. Data can help us overcome some of these problems. And looking at what's happening, but also looking at what isn't happening. And in Burkhart's presentation, he talked about trips that were not cycled. And I think that's really important. Trips that could be cycled. Trips that, with infrastructure, policy change, people might cycle. So one thing that I've been working on is looking at risk. One problem that we have in Britain is that many places we have very little cycling. Therefore, we have few injuries. And therefore we have no problem. No cyclists are dying, therefore nothing gets done, no improvements are made. And I think that looking at risk per cyclist is really crucial. Looking at the number of cyclists using a route and the injuries per cyclist gives you a different picture. And you can see, okay, for each cyclist using this junction, using this road, what is the level of risk compared to another road? And also, as I said, measuring potential, what cycling levels might be if people felt safer. So just to give you an example of how the picture changes when you think about risk. So this is cycling deaths and serious injuries, we call them KSIs, per London Borough between 2005 and 15. So the dark colours have the highest numbers of deaths and serious injuries. So there is a perception that cycling in central London is particularly dangerous. It's more dangerous than it should be. But it is not the most dangerous part of London. But because of these figures, there is much more investment in central London. But if you look at risk, as in risk per commuter, risk per cyclist, rather than the absolute numbers, you get a very different picture. So for every person cycling in the outer London borough of Harrow, their risk of being killed or seriously injured is around 7 times higher than cyclists in central London. But if we only look at absolute numbers of deaths and injury, we won't see that risk. So it's really important to actually, not just get the data, but also do analysis that allows you to say, per person cycling in that borough, what is the risk for them? Because the problem is, no one cycles in those outer boroughs, so otherwise you don't know how risky it is, because you don't get the high-profile deaths and serious injuries. My other example I just wanted to give was around cycling potential. So, as Burkhart was saying, there are many, many short trips that could easily be cycled. And calculating this in Britain has been quite useful, because often we're told it's too hilly or everybody's trip is too long. And that proves not to be the case. Really, what's the problem is conditions like this. This is my hometown. I never cycled here. It was never attractive as a teenager to jump on a bike in that kind of environment. But if you calculate cycling potential, you can actually bring that into the debate. You can say, if we made this road safe, suddenly there could be thousands of cyclists on this road. At the moment, there's virtually no cyclists. You just don't see cyclists. And therefore, planners assume we don't need to plan for cycling. There are no cyclists. So a tool that I've been involved in, funded by the English Department for Transport, has actually calculated cycling potential and then mapped it to the street network. So you can see, under different scenarios, what levels of cycling might be. So along that road I just showed you, potentially there could be 1,000, 2,000 commuters cycling along there, based on the kind of trips that people are making, if we cycled trips like the Dutch do, in terms of, a 3-kilometre trip, we were as likely to cycle it as the Dutch. So making this visible, I think, is really important. Looking at the cycling that isn't happening and saying, if we create good cycling conditions, not things that look like that, then we could actually have a lot of cycling. So just to some final thoughts, really, what I've a few things that I've learned from researching this from the last 10 years now, really. I think qualitative experience and experienced risk are really important, finding out about people's experiences, what they feel on the roads, which is often quite closely connected to risk and to, people's likelihood of being injured. I also think those qualitative experiences can also be mapped, can also be quantified. Equity means an inclusive design approach. We need to build for the groups that are not cycling at the moment, and we can create a system that works for all. If we can create something that's good enough for an 8-year-old, it'll be good enough for all of us. That's really important. And just finally, in societies that are car dependent, which I would certainly say that Britain is, in car dependent societies where cycling is marginalised, we do need to challenge car dominance. It is always really difficult, in London even, in London, where increasingly people don't drive, to take away car parking spaces, to take away space for cars. It's always a fight. But if we don't do it, we risk cycling and walking, say, being played off against each other. We need to take space from cars, and I think when I give, in the afternoon, when I give a couple of slides from London, I'll sort of illustrate how space was taken from cars for cycle routes, and it was difficult, but it did happen. So, thank you.